Hi guys, tonight. If you are listening to this as the room has grown quiet, as the lights have dimmed, and the modern world begins to step back, try to imagine a moment very far away. No cities, no borders, no writing, no recorded history, no names for nations, only darkness, cold stone, and human beings. 40,000 years ago, our ancestors did not leave diaries. They did not build monuments. They did not write down what had happened, but they did something else. They drew. Deep inside caves where sunlight never reached, they painted animals in motion, hands pressed against stone lines and marks that did not resemble anything found in nature. These images were not created to be sold, not to decorate, not to impress future generations. They were created to remember, to pass something on, to keep the world from dissolving into silence. Long before civilization, humans were already creatures of imagination, and perhaps that is why we are still here today. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? What time is it for you now? In this video, we will travel backward through time, not to search for a lost civilization, not to decode sensational mysteries, but to listen to a much quieter story. A story of art before history, of images created before writing existed, of human memory preserved not on paper, but in stone. If you are listening from somewhere far away, perhaps New York, as evening settles in London, well past midnight, or a quiet room somewhere in Asia, let your breathing slow. No need to memorize, no need to analyze. Just stay here for a while. Because before humans built the outer world, we learned how to build the inner one, and everything began there. When we speak of history, we usually think of writing, words carved into stone, records pressed into clay, scrolls bearing the names of kings, wars, and dynasties. But history in that sense began very late, about 5,000 years ago. Before that lies a stretch of time almost impossible to imagine. Not long in the sense of a few generations. Not long in the sense of a dynasty rising and falling. But long in the rhythm of ice advancing and retreating. Long in cycles that a single lifetime could never fully perceive. There were no precise dates, no chronicles, no clear beginning. Time was not divided into years, months, or eras. It was felt through repetition. The cold season returning herds, changing direction, water sources drying and filling again. There were only humans, and the world they had to learn to live with. Not living in the world, but living alongside it as a small, vulnerable part, constantly adjusting in order not to be erased. 40,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were already biologically complete. Their bodies were not very different from ours. Bones with the same structure, spines curved in the same way, hands with opposable thumbs, flexible enough to grip carved draw and feel surfaces with precision. Their brains had the same volume. The regions processing images, movement, and emotion were already developed in ways we would recognize. Their senses received light, color, and form according to the same principles we use today. Light entered their eyes and was processed by the same areas of the brain. The sudden movement of an animal triggered the same alert responses. Subtle changes in soil or leaf color carried survival meaning just as they do for us. They did not see the world differently. They lived in a different world. If one of us were suddenly transported back to that time, our bodies would not be what set us apart. The heartbeat would be the same. Breathing would follow the same rhythm. Our hands could still hold a piece of charcoal and draw familiar lines on stone. What would overwhelm us would be the world itself, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it offered no protection. There were no houses, no walls separating humans from the cold wind, no roofs designed to endure many seasons of rain, no foundations laid with the thought we will stay here for generations. No place was built with future generations in mind. Every shelter was temporary, a rock face that blocked the wind until the wind shifted, a shallow cave that stayed dry until the rains persisted, a frame of skin and wood enough for a few weeks, then dismantled, leaving almost no trace behind. These places were not chosen for comfort. They were chosen because for a time they allowed life to continue. People did not return home each day. They returned to a location they hoped would still be safe that night. Their living space was not a fixed point on a map, but a sequence of pauses. Pausing to rest, pausing to eat, pausing to wait for weather to change, then moving on. Even memory of shelter was not tied to architecture. It was tied to fragile cues, a rock face with a recognizable shape, a cave entrance narrow enough to keep large animals out, a hidden exit in case retreat was needed at night. In such a world, humans could not leave much behind. Everything carried had to justify itself. And because of that, anything created in these shelters, if it was to endure, had to hold meaning great enough to deserve the effort of preserving it. Not every shelter became a place of drawing. Not every rock surface was touched by images. Only a very small number of spaces were chosen, spaces sufficiently removed from daily life, deep enough that daylight could not erase them, stable enough that images could remain even after people had gone. And from these temporary shelters, in rare moments of stillness between movements, humans began to do something unusual. They left marks not to protect their bodies, but to remember. There were no villages, no concept of a community tied to a fixed location, no long defended borders, no homeland in the stable geographic sense. Groups survived through their ability to move together, share food, and maintain bonds strong enough to endure hunger, illness, and conflict. There was no agriculture, no seed saved for the next season, no land cultivated year after year, no guarantee that tomorrow would bring food if today failed. Everything depended on understanding the natural world, how herds moved, which plants were edible, when to leave before a place became dangerous. And there was no concept of staying in one place. To stay still meant risk. To stay too long could mean death. Their world was not designed for stability. It forced humans to be flexible, to remember, and to transmit experience faster than the environment could change. In such a world, the most valuable thing was not possession, it was memory. And from that pressure, from the need to preserve what could not be carried by the body, humans began to seek another way to remember. Not through writing, not through spoken words alone, but through images. Their lives did not unfold in fixed daily routines, but through cycles of movement. They followed herds because herds meant food, and food meant survival for the group. They followed the rains because water shaped plants, and plants shaped where animals appeared. They followed regions that still allowed existence, places not yet depleted, not yet too dangerous, not yet demanding immediate departure. There were no fixed routes, no exact schedules, only constant adjustment to a changing world. In such a world, everything was fragile. Food was uncertain. A failed hunt was not just a hungry day. It could begin a chain of risks with no clear end. Climate was unstable. Extended cold periods, rains arriving too early or too late, could erase a familiar source of life entirely. There was no way to control these changes. They could only be recognized when it was already too late. Life expectancy was short, not because humans were weak, but because accidents, disease, and harsh environments cut lives short without warning. Death did not wait at the end of a long journey. It appeared at any moment during a hunt on the move, or in a cold night without sufficient shelter. Because death was always near, every decision mattered. Time could not be wasted. Energy could not be spent on what was useless. And yet in this context, humans still spent time and energy on something that did not directly help them survive that day. They created images. They stopped, lit a fire, held charcoal stone or bone, and left marks that did not aid hunting, did not block rain, did not keep them warm. Not because they had excess, not because they were idle, and certainly not for entertainment. These actions were performed in scarcity, in dim light, in moments when energy should have been reserved for survival. They created images because there were things that could not be carried by the body. A person could remember where a herd once passed, but that memory would vanish when the person died. A group could pass knowledge through speech, but speech disappeared when there was no one left to hear it. Images were different. Placed on stone, they required no storyteller. They needed no original witness. They existed even when their makers were gone. In a world where everything was temporary, images became the only way to keep something longer than a single life. And from that very practical need, not from abundance, art began. Not as decoration, not as beauty, but as a quiet tool to resist disappearance, memory of vanished herds, the movement of prey trapped against stone, fear felt before a predator at night, or the presence of those no longer alive. These things, if not preserved, would dissolve. And when memory dissolves, experience dissolves with it. Art at that time was not beauty, it was memory. A memory not stored in a single mind, but placed into stone, into bone, into the surface of the world. When a group returned to the same place after many moons, they did not see only a cave. They saw familiar images, signs that said we were here before. We learned something here, and it still matters. That is why the earliest human images are not found in places easily seen. They were not drawn outdoors, not along pathways, not in daily living spaces. They lie deep underground, where even a small flame matters, where hundreds of meters must be crossed in darkness to reach the wall. This was not accidental. What was placed there was not meant for daylight, not for passers-by. It was meant for collective memory, for serious moments, for times when a community needed to remember who they were and what the world had taught them. In the next part, we will enter those spaces, the first caves where humans did not only seek shelter, but began to speak with time through images. And when the first flames were lit in that darkness, art truly began. When humans first began to leave images behind, they did not choose the light. They did not draw on surfaces easily seen under the sun. They did not draw in the spaces of everyday living where the fire burned constantly and people gathered to eat, to rest, to recover. Instead, they carried their earliest images deep into the earth, into spaces that daylight could not reach. That was a deliberate choice. Because to enter those spaces, humans had to step away from the familiar rhythm of life. They had to set aside the essential tasks of daytime, even temporarily. They left the relatively safer world behind, carried a fragile flame with them, and accepted darkness as part of the journey. These were not short walks. There were caves where people had to feel their way, along rock walls in the dark for hundreds of meters, had to lower their bodies to avoid low stone outcrops, had to crawl through narrow passages where the ground was damp, cold, and slick. Every step demanded absolute attention because one small mistake could extinguish the flame or force the entire group to turn back in silence. In that space, light was never stable. It trembled with every movement of the person holding the torch, threw shadows onto the ceiling, stretched and collapsed with the rhythm of breathing. The shapes on the cave wall did not appear all at once. They revealed themselves gradually, piece by piece, as the flames swept across the uneven surface. And it was precisely in those hard-to-reach places that they stopped. Not to take shelter for long, not to rest. They stopped to light the stone wall and to draw. That action required time. It required patience in a space that was cold, damp, and short of air. It required coordination, someone to keep the fire alive, someone to prepare the pigment, someone to choose the right surface. And it required an unspoken agreement that this mattered enough for the whole group to spend energy on it. Because in darkness that deep, there is no room for improvisation. These spaces do not encourage accidental pauses. They do not invite you in. They are not easily accessible. And for that reason, anything done there is a choice, serious, intentional, carrying a weight that reaches beyond immediate need. Here, images did not dissolve into daily life. They were not faded by daylight, not covered by everyday activity, not erased by constant movement. In the Earth's interior, images were pulled away from the short rhythm of human time and placed into another rhythm, one shaped by stone, by darkness, by a rare stability. And it was in spaces like these, when a flickering flame lit the rock face, that humans began to do something they could not do anywhere else. They left marks not for the present, but for a time that had not yet arrived. This raises a fundamental question. In a world where energy was always scarce, where every decision was directly tied to survival, why would humans choose a difficult and dangerous space like this to create images? The answer is not beauty, and it is not spontaneity. It lies in the way humans began to distinguish living space from remembering space. Archaeological evidence shows this clearly. Ancient painted caves were not places where humans lived regularly. There are no thick layers of ash from fires maintained through many seasons, no accumulations of broken bones from repeated meals, no stacks of everyday tools forgotten and layered over time. The ground in these spaces is often strangely clean, as if people were careful to leave behind very little of ordinary living. That absence is not accidental. In archaeology, what does not appear can matter as much as what is found. When there are no signs of long-term cooking, no domestic waste, no sediment layers suggesting prolonged residence, it means people did not come here to live. They came and they left, and each visit carried a clear purpose. These spaces were used in uneven rhythms, perhaps seasonally, perhaps at special moments in the life cycle of the group. They were not tied to daily needs, but to selected moments when the community needed to stop to remember or to reaffirm something beyond immediate survival. That is why painted caves did not function as homes. A home is a place you return to every day, where traces accumulate gradually through habit, where the disorder of life leaves visible layers in soil and stone. But here the order and emptiness suggest an entirely different use, intentional, limited, and selective. When humans entered these spaces, they did not bring their whole life with them. They carried only a small portion, just enough to make light, just enough to create images, and just enough to complete what they had come to do. Then they left, leaving images behind in a space that was almost untouched by daily activity. This created a very early division in human thinking, between a place to live and a place to remember, between the space of immediate needs and the space of things that had to be kept longer than one cycle of movement. In the prehistoric world where everything was temporary, setting aside a space for memory was a decision with weight. These caves were not chosen for convenience. They were chosen for their ability to separate life from the short time scale of the everyday. Their images were not hidden by constant activity, not replaced by new needs. They existed in another rhythm, slower, steadier, closer to the time of stone than to the time of humans. And it was only in spaces like that that images could do what spoken words and individual memory could not remain. Not to be seen every day, but to be found again when necessary. Not to serve the present, but to connect the present to a longer chain beyond the limits of a single life. One such place is Chauvet Cave in southern France. The drawings inside have been dated to around 36,000 years ago. When they were discovered, they forced archaeologists to reconsider every assumption about the artistic ability of prehistoric humans. Cave lions, woolly rhinoceroses, wild horses appear with accurate proportions, a clear sense of movement, and layered composition that creates depth. These are not clumsy lines from an apprentice stage. From the beginning, the images reached a level that modern humans can still recognize as convincing. This suggests that when humans began to draw, they did not begin from zero. The ability to observe animals to understand weight and direction, running rhythm and momentum, had been accumulated through tens of thousands of years of hunting and survival. The images did not create new knowledge. They condensed existing knowledge and fixed it inside a space that changed very little. If Chauvet reveals precision, then Lascaux, around 17,000 years ago, reveals something else: the way humans organized images in space. The walls were not used randomly. Animals were arranged in groups by viewing direction, by the rhythm of the rock surface. As the flame moved, the shadow of the torchbearer slid across the figures, creating the sensation that the animals were moving with the light. This is not an accidental effect. Many researchers argue that spaces like Lascaux were designed to be experienced by firelight, not by static illumination. Images in darkness were not made to be seen alone. They existed to be activated in communal moments, when light trembled, when memory was called back through familiar forms of animals that once sustained the whole group. Not everyone entered these caves, and not everyone touched the drawings. That selectiveness itself made the space distinct from ordinary life. At El Castillo in Spain, ancient handprints dated to more than 40,000 years ago tell a different story. No animals, no hunting scenes, only the shape of a human hand placed on stone and left as a mark. It is a simple gesture, yet in a prehistoric context, it carries deep meaning. In a world of constant movement where traces are easily erased, the hand becomes a way to affirm presence across time. No name, no language, only the outline of the body itself. What all of these spaces share is separation. They exist outside the stream of daily living, far from sunlight and from the rapid changes of the outside world. People did not pass them by accidentally. They had to deliberately leave familiar paths, step into a different rhythm, slower, quieter, less touched by the world above. Here, darkness was not merely the absence of light, it was stability. In the deep darkness of caves, time moved differently. Temperature fluctuated less. Wind did not reach. Rain did not erase traces. Light did not continuously reveal and conceal, sharpen and blur the stone surface. The absence of rapid change created something rare in the prehistoric world, a space where humans could trust that what they left behind would not disappear immediately. In darkness, images faded less. They were interfered with less. They were less entangled with other activities. They did not compete with daily life to be seen. They were not used and discarded. They were not replaced by new needs. Their images could exist according to the rhythm of stone, slow, durable, outlasting countless cycles of human movement. And that is why darkness became a kind of natural protection for memory. Not because humans understood chemistry or geology, but because through experience, they learned that some places allowed traces to remain longer than others. And when a community lives in conditions where everything is easily lost, the ability to keep anything for long becomes profoundly important. Art in this period did not arise from surplus. It was not the product of leisure, of excess energy, of a society guaranteed safety. It appeared in a world where time was constantly fragmented by survival needs, and energy had to be calculated with care, which means that if humans chose to draw, it could not be random. It could not be only for the emotion of one individual, because in that context, anything that consumed time and effort had to be accepted, sometimes even supported by the group. Someone held the flame. Someone stood watch. Someone waited. That shared agreement shows that drawing held value beyond immediate benefit. That value was not material. It lay in the ability to preserve what could not be allowed to vanish. A person could die taking their memory with them, but an image on stone could not. When the group accepted spending energy on art, they were investing in something that did not serve that single day. They were investing in an uncertain future, one where others, perhaps descendants, perhaps other groups returning later, would need these traces to understand, to remember, and to continue. In scarcity, what is preserved always reveals what is essential. And the fact that art was preserved, carried into the most stable spaces humans knew, shows that from very early on, humans treated collective memory as indispensable to survival. Not the memory of one person, but the memory of an entire chain of people connected through time, in a world always ready to erase their traces. A cave painting does not speak to the one who made it. It speaks to the one who comes after, to those who return to the same space many years later, even many generations later. It does not tell a story in sequence. It does not explain. It does not instruct. But it is present. And that presence alone is enough to activate memory experience and a sense of belonging to something longer than a single life. In that way, prehistoric humans began to exceed their biological limits, not through technology, not through power, but through images placed in the right place in darkness where time could not easily erase them. In the next part, we will look more closely at the most direct traces of that presence, not images of the outside world, but images of humans themselves, hands on stone, and the beginning of identity. Amid the animal figures drawn with astonishing accuracy, amid the abstract lines and the compositions placed deep within darkness, there is one kind of trace that appears again and again. It is so simple, it is almost crude, requiring no technique, no composition, no refined power of observation. It is the hand, not a hand holding a tool, not a hand in action, not a hand hunting building or producing any visible outcome, only the shape of a human hand placed on stone and left behind as a negative space of the body itself. Here, what is recorded is not skill, not strength, not the result of labor, only presence, a hand at rest open pressed against the cold, hard surface of rock, not clenched, not gripping, only placed down almost as if to test whether that surface truly exists. The stone does not respond, but the body does. Cold passes through the skin. The unevenness becomes clear in the palm. Each finger touches the world in its own distinct way, leaving a shape that fits perfectly, impossible to mistake. It is a gesture so light, almost without ambition, as if its only purpose were to confirm that a living body once touched this world at that moment in that exact place. There is no effort to make that moment into something grand, no exaggeration, no intent to leave a superior mark, only direct contact between body and stone, between what is living and what endures far longer than life itself. In many prehistoric caves, these hand marks are not placed at the center. They do not take up the widest surfaces, nor are they set on flat, easily observed panels. They do not greet the entrant with an obvious presence. Instead, they are often off to one side, hidden in positions where firelight only passes for an instant. Sometimes they run along a narrow passage where a person must feel the wall to avoid falling. Sometimes they appear on small, uneven rock faces that do not invite the eye. Sometimes they sit in places where, if you do not stop, if you do not turn back, you can easily walk past without noticing anything at all. That choice of placement does not suggest a desire to be seen immediately. There is no sign of seeking attention or occupying space. These hands do not demand light, do not need the center, do not need an audience. They accept the edge, the margin of the cave. The places only those who move slowly enough, carefully enough, attentively enough will ever notice. And this is what gives them a character entirely different from the animal paintings or the large cave compositions. If those images were placed to remember the outer world herd's movement, environment, then the handprints were placed to remember something far quieter, the presence of a body, not at the center of the story, not in a prominent position, but in a place just sufficient to exist, just sufficient not to disappear. In the darkness of the cave, where the flame is only enough to light a few brief moments, those hand marks feel like very small whispers. They do not call. They do not cling. They are simply there, waiting for someone who comes later by chance or by choice to see. Their arrangement does not suggest display. No effort to impress. No sign of trying to draw the gaze or establish status within the space. These hand marks do not dominate the surface. They do not expand outward, do not repeat with a pounding rhythm, do not create an overwhelming effect. They stop exactly at what is necessary, as if the person who made them knew perfectly well that nothing more was required. They do not tell a story of hunting. They do not describe the outer world with herds, familiar movements, or dangers once faced. They do not reenact scenes tied directly to survival, do not record victory or defeat. While much prehistoric art points outward toward environment, toward food, toward the relationship between humans and the world, the handprints turn inward. They do not explain. They do not instruct. They do not point to what should happen next. They do not attempt to transmit information in the modern sense. There is no content to decode, no packaged message that later viewers must interpret correctly. They simply exist. That existence comes without commentary, no context, no frame of interpretation. A handprint on stone does not say, "Do as we did." It does not say, "Remember this." It does not even say, "Understand me." It only remains there as a fact that does not need justification. And it is precisely this total simplicity that makes the handprints different from every other image in the cave. They do not compete with the animal drawings in complexity. They do not converse visually with large compositions. They do not demand that the viewer linger long or think hard. And yet they remain quietly, persistently, in a space where almost everything else is easy to lose. In the prehistoric world where value is usually tied to survival, leaving behind a trace that does not directly serve, survival is a notable choice. It shows that there were things humans wanted to keep, not because they were immediately useful, but because they affirmed something more fundamental, that someone was here. Not as a hunter, not as a victor, not as an individual with power, only as a human being who once stood in this darkness and left a trace of presence, small enough not to overwhelm the world, but clear enough not to vanish entirely. While animal drawings can be understood as memory of environment, of food, of survival relationships between humans and the surrounding world, the handprints point towards something entirely different. They point toward the human being not as a hunter, not as a functional member of the group, but as a body present in space and time. The hand on stone does not try to say something grand. It makes no proclamation. It does not demand to be remembered. And because of that, it becomes one of the most direct traces of humans recognizing their own existence, not through action, not through achievement, only by placing the body into the world and leaving a mark just sufficient to say someone was here. They simply remain, and it is that silent presence that has made archaeologists stop for a long time before them. One of the most emblematic places is El Castillo, where handprints have been dated to more than 40,000 years ago. Time here is not measured only by numbers, but by the persistence of a gesture repeated in the same space across many generations. Some of the handprints, by their size and proportions, appear to belong to very young individuals, smaller hands, shorter fingers, spacing between finger joints not yet fully developed. They are not rare exceptions. They appear often enough that they cannot be dismissed as random. This alone tells us much. In a world where survival demands discipline, where every journey into darkness carries obvious risk, bringing children into spaces like this cannot have been a sudden, impulsive decision. Deep darkness, narrow terrain, and fragile firelight are not places for careless acts. The presence of children shows that this was not a private gesture by one person, nor a secret act meant only for a small inner circle. It was part of community life, accepted, regulated, and carried out under conditions the whole group considered safe enough and necessary enough. That implies a very early level of organization. Not organization in the sense of power or hierarchy, but organization in the sense of shared responsibility. Someone led the way, someone kept the fire alive, someone watched. And there were moments when children were allowed to take part, to place their small hands on the same stone surface where adults had placed theirs before. This action was not meant to teach children drawing technique. It was not meant to pass down a specific survival skill. It taught something else quieter, but far more durable. It taught that there are spaces that do not belong to everyday life. There are places to which one returns not for immediate need, but for memory. When a child places their hand on stone beside or over an older handprint, they are not only making a physical gesture, they are being brought into a continuous chain, a chain of those who were here before, who touched this same surface, and who left. There is no long explanation, no story told in chronological order, only a repeated action enough for the body to remember that it belongs to something larger than itself. Repeated across generations, the handprint becomes a form of collective memory. Not memory stored in one person's head, but memory placed into space so that anyone who returns can touch it. In that context, the children's handprints at El Castillo are not a side detail. They are evidence that from very early on, humans sought to pass down not only knowledge of the world, but also the feeling of belonging to a timeline longer than a single life. The method of making these handprints is also relatively consistent. The hand is placed flush against the rock surface. Pigment, often mineral powder mixed with water or a natural binding substance, is sprayed or blown around it. When the hand is removed, the stone beneath appears as a negative silhouette of the body. The act is not complex. It does not require refined drawing technique. It does not require prolonged training. And precisely because of that, it raises an important question. If not to display skill, then why? In this case, the hand does not depict the world. It does not recreate animals, landscapes, or motion. It depicts the human being, not a particular individual with a name or a private story, but the presence of a body that once stood there in that moment. In a prehistoric world where humans constantly moved, where footprints were erased by rain, where shelters were abandoned, after each season, presence was the easiest thing to lose. The hand on stone became a way to say, a human being stood here. No language needed, no explanation, only the shape of the body itself. Notably, these handprints rarely stand alone. They often appear in clusters, sometimes overlapping, sometimes lining the deeper paths of a cave. That arrangement suggests this was not a spontaneous gesture. It was repeated and may have been tied to specific moments in the community's life cycle. There is no definitive evidence to confirm this was religious ritual in the strict sense. But it cannot be treated as accidental traces either. Position, quantity, and method all indicate a high degree of intention. Here, the hand is not a personal signature in the modern sense. It does not say, "This is me." It says, "We were here." That difference matters. In hunter-gatherer society, individual identity is not separate from the group. A person's existence has meaning only within connection to others, and the handprints on stone reflect exactly that. They do not distinguish who came first or who was best. They carry no rank or power. They record presence as part of an ongoing chain. A handprint is not there to be admired every day. It lies in darkness in a place seen only by those who choose to go there. And when someone many years later enters that same space under flickering firelight, they do not see only an image. They see an empty space shaped perfectly for their own hand. And in that moment, a very particular connection forms. Not through words, not through story, but through the similarity of the body itself. The hand of someone who died long ago and the hand of someone still living share the same shape, the same structure, the same ability to touch stone in the same way. In a world without writing, this is a form of communication across time, simple and direct to a startling degree. Not every prehistoric image is descriptive or symbolically complex. Sometimes what humans needed to preserve was not knowledge of the outer world, but proof that they had existed. The hand on stone does not teach hunting. It does not mark routes. It does not transmit technique, but it does something else quietly and persistently. It affirms that in this darkness before villages, before history, a human being once stood here and left a trace. Not to have their name remembered, but not to disappear completely. And from these simple handprints, we can see something very early in human history, the need to be present not only in the moment of living, but within a timeline longer than a single life. In the next part, we will leave the handprints behind and step into another kind of image, abstract signs and patterns, where humans do not only say, "I was here," but begin to speak in marks no longer directly tied to the body itself. If the handprints on stone were the way humans affirmed that they had once been present, then the shaped human forms tell a different story. No longer the moment of touching the world, but the effort to hold on to life in a world that was always threatening to take it away. At a very early point in human history, people began to create figures that were no longer direct traces of the real body, but selected versions of that body. Not every detail was kept. Not every line was necessary. What remained were the parts considered most important, the parts tied to life, to the ability to endure, and to continuation through time. These forms were small enough to fit neatly in the palm of a hand. They were carved from limestone bone ivory or clay materials that could be found along a moving journey. Materials not excessively rare, but durable enough to hold their shape across many years. Their size was not accidental. A large object would force people to stay in one place. A small object allowed them to keep moving, and humans at that time could not stop for long. These figures were not fixed inside caves. They were not anchored to a particular wall of stone. They did not belong to a separated space in the way cave paintings did. They could be carried, placed into a leather pouch, held in the hand, moved with people across different lands, across different seasons, across different groups. And because they were mobile, they appear and disappear from the archaeological record in ways that are difficult to trace. They leave no clear, heavy layers of sediment. They do not remain tied to one location long enough to build up thick deposits. They could be lost, abandoned, buried by accident, or carried far away from the place where they were made. And this is what makes them different from cave paintings or handprints on rock. Images on cave walls are bound to a specific space. They wait for humans to return. But these small forms travel with humans. They do not wait, they accompany. And that companionship marks a crucial shift in the way humans thought about images. Images were no longer only something placed into the world so that the world could remember. Images became something humans carried so that they themselves could remember. The space of memory was no longer entirely outside in the cave in the darkness. It began to be reduced, compressed, and placed into an object that could be touched, could be held, and could be carried through the long journey of survival. And for that reason, these forms were unlike anything that had come before. They did not mark a location, they marked an idea. They did not record a moment that had passed. They held on to what humans did not want, to lose the idea of life in a world where life had to move in order to endure. Among the best-known artifacts is the Venus of Willendorf, discovered in Austria and dated to around 25,000 years ago. This small figurine has no clearly defined face. No eyes, no nose, no expression. Its head is covered in spiraling carved lines, perhaps hair a cap or some kind of covering. But the parts of the body that are emphasized lie elsewhere, not the face, not the eyes or expression, not hands grasping or legs in motion. These figures concentrate attention on regions of the human body that become heavier, slower, and more vulnerable, yet are also the regions tied directly to the ability to sustain life. Large breasts, a swollen belly, wide hips, thick thighs. These lines do not make the body more agile. They do not help it run faster over uneven ground. They offer no direct advantage in hunting or escaping predators. On the contrary, these are the parts of the body that make movement more difficult, that increase risk in a world that always demanded flexibility. And precisely for that reason, the fact that they are emphasized so consistently is all the more striking. These features relate directly to pregnancy, childbirth, and nurturing processes that are slow, prolonged, and full of danger in a prehistoric context. They do not create immediate results. They require time, care, and the protection of an entire community. In a world where value is often measured by the ability to react quickly to danger, choosing to emphasize parts of the body associated with slowing down suggests that a very different system of values was taking shape. Here, what matters is not victory in a single moment, but the ability to extend existence across multiple cycles of life. These forms do not glorify strength in the muscular sense. They do not celebrate speed or immediate efficiency. They focus on what is most fragile and therefore most essential about human life. And Venus of Willendorf is not an isolated case. Similar bodily features appear again and again across hundreds of artifacts found throughout Europe and parts of Asia from the same period, or a closely related one. Though created in different places from different materials, they share a remarkably consistent visual language. That repetition cannot be explained by personal taste or random aesthetics. It suggests a wide agreement about what mattered enough to be preserved in image. Whoever made these figures, whoever they were, selected the same set of traits to emphasize and omitted the same set of details. Faces were often reduced or obscured. Hands and feet could be minimized or omitted. But the regions tied to reproduction and nurturing were rarely softened. This implies that these figures were not meant to portray a specific individual, but to preserve a concept of the body, a condensed image of human life under harsh survival conditions. They do not speak of one particular woman who once existed. They speak of what the community could not afford to lose. In archaeology, consistency repeated across wide space and long time is often a sign of a shared idea deeply embedded in collective thinking. Here, that idea is not power, not conquest, It is the ability for life to continue in a world always threatening to end it. And from this clear emphasis, we can see something important. When humans first chose to shape their own bodies in image, they did not choose to see themselves as conquerors. They saw themselves as fragile beings needing protection and needing to continue at any cost. These figures are not identical, but they share highly consistent features: the emphasis on parts of the body related to reproduction, and the reduction or simplification of face, hands, and feet. That consistency cannot be accidental. However, an important point must be stated clearly. There is no definitive scientific evidence proving that these figurines were fertility goddesses or symbols of a complete religious system. Modern archaeology is very cautious with interpretations like that. We have no texts, no described rituals, no clear, consistent usage context for each case. But that caution does not diminish the significance of the figures themselves, because whatever their purpose, they still reflect one undeniable fact. Humans chose life as the center of their image of themselves, not humans as successful hunters, not humans as rulers over the environment, but humans as bodies capable of continuation in a world where that continuation was always precarious. The period in which these figurines appear was one of cold, harsh, and violently fluctuating climate so intense it is difficult to imagine through modern experience. Glacial cycles did not merely lower temperature, they altered the entire rhythm of human life. Snow and ice covered large parts of Europe for long phases. Vegetation was thinner. Herds moved along routes that were hard to predict. Land that could once support life became barren or temporarily unreachable. Food was unstable. There were no crops to wait for. No large stores capable of resisting consecutive years of harshness. Each group lived in a state of constant adjustment, moving when necessary, shrinking when forced to, and accepting that any season could be the last. Average lifespan was low, not only because of illness or accident, but because the human body was forced to operate constantly at the edge of endurance. Cold nutritional scarcity and prolonged survival stress made simply getting through each stage of life a challenge. In that context, pregnancy itself was a risk. A body had to nourish another life while it might not have enough food, enough energy, enough safety. Childbirth in prehistoric conditions came without medical support, no medicines, no stable warm shelter. A single small complication could lead to an irreversible loss. And even if childbirth succeeded, the trial was not over. The first years of a child's life are the most fragile stage. Poor temperature regulation, an immune system not yet complete, near total dependence on surrounding adults. For a child to survive those early years required more than the effort of one person. It required the protection of the entire group. Food had to be shared. Movement had to be adjusted. Risks had to be distributed and carried together. So, in that world, for a woman to become pregnant, give birth successfully, and keep a child alive through the first years was not a given. It was not nature's default outcome. It was a collective achievement. A silent victory, without cheers, without a dramatic climax, yet carrying survival, meaning no less important than a successful hunt. A hunt might feed the group for days, for weeks. But a child who survives is the continuation of the community for decades to come. And in that harsh context, the choice to shape and preserve figures emphasizing childbirth and nurturing is not romance or vague worship. It is a way of recognizing what is most precious in a world always ready to take it away. Not the force of a blow, not the speed of the chase, but the ability for life not to end with this generation. These exaggerated forms did not need to be beautiful by modern standards. They needed to be effective for survival within imagination and within the community's memory. They were a condensation of what mattered most. Another notable detail: most of these figurines do not stand upright if placed vertically. They were not designed for display. They were designed to be held. That suggests the relationship between humans and these forms was intimate, personal, tactile. They were not only seen, they were touched, held, carried during movement. In a world without surplus objects, carrying an item that does not directly serve survival is a considered choice. It shows that these forms met a different need, the need to hold on to the idea of life, even as surrounding conditions continually threatened it. If handprints on stone were the way humans said I was here, then these forms say, we want to remain here. They do not record a moment. They record the possibility of extending that moment into the next generation. That also explains why these figurines rarely have individual faces. They do not represent a particular person. They represent a survival role, a body carrying the function of continuation, not tied to personal identity, but tied to the existence of the group. Some researchers have asked whether these figurines might have been made by women viewing their own bodies from a personal perspective. It is a compelling question, but at present it cannot be answered with certainty. There is no direct evidence confirming who created these forms, and perhaps that matters less than the fact that the community accepted them. Whoever made them, they survived long enough, spread widely enough to become part of collective memory. When we place these figurines beside handprints on stone, we can see a subtle shift. The handprint is a moment. The human form is a cycle. The handprint records having touched the world. The figurine records the possibility that the world can continue through the human body. This is a significant step in symbolic thinking. No longer only immediate presence, but reflection on time, longer than a single life. These forms do not tell us what prehistoric humans believed in the religious sense, but they do tell us what they worried about. They worried about the fragility of life. They worried about losing the ability to continue. And they sought to hold on to that idea through image, through object, something that could be carried and touched. In an uncertain world, that is a profoundly human act. In the next part, we will leave the shaped body behind and step into something even more abstract: patterns and signs that no longer depict humans or the outside world, but reflect the way humans began to think in symbols. Where images no longer resemble anything familiar, yet open the possibility of storing and transmitting ideas far more complex than ever before. If the handprints on stone reveal the moment humans first recognized their own presence, and if the shaped human forms reflect an early obsession with life and the possibility of continuation, then abstract patterns mark another shift, quieter, harder to grasp, but perhaps the most important in the entire history of human thought. Here the image no longer resembles anything familiar in the natural world. Not animals with shapes and movements that can be recognized. Not humans with bodies, postures, or traces of physical presence. Not even handprints or footprints, direct evidence that a body once touched a space. Instead, there are straight lines that extend and then stop abruptly. Dots placed side by side, regularly or deliberately out of rhythm. Zigzags that do not lead the viewer's eye to any familiar object. Parallel strokes, hooked shapes, repeated combinations that, if removed from their archaeological context, almost seem to say nothing at all. They do not imitate the world. They do not try to resemble something that has been seen. And that is precisely what makes them unusual. These images appear on rock walls sometimes right beside very clear animal drawings, as if they belong to the same space but not to the same language. In other places, they are set apart deeper in the cave, in positions that require the viewer to actively seek them out, as if they were not made to be noticed immediately. That parallel existence is striking. Within the same cave, humans drew the world as they saw it, and at the same time drew signs that represent nothing visible at all. These two modes of image making exist side by side without canceling each other out, as if reflecting two layers of thought operating at once. And it is here that a foundational question begins to emerge. Why did humans begin to draw things that do not look like anything in the surrounding world? To draw an animal, a person must observe, remember, and recreate. The image remains tightly bound to direct experience what was seen, what was hunted, what was confronted. But to draw an abstract sign, humans had to do something entirely different. They had to set the visible world aside and begin working with ideas that have no clear shape. A straight line is not something that exists ready-made in nature. A string of dots does not naturally carry meaning. A zigzag does not represent a specific creature. These signs become meaningful only when placed inside a shared system of understanding. They require collective memory, they require learning, and they require faith that those who come later will see the same sign and understand it in the same way. This is no longer art in the sense of representation. This is art as a tool for thinking. By drawing forms that resemble nothing, humans were testing a new ability, the ability for meaning to exist without needing a familiar shape to cling to. They were learning how to preserve what matters, not by imitating the world, but by encoding it. And once that happens, the image is no longer only the memory of what was seen. It becomes a way to hold what cannot be seen. Cycles, rules, connections, and concepts that exceed the direct experience of any single individual. This is the moment when art begins to touch abstract thought. Not loudly, not suddenly, but irreversibly. These abstract patterns were not isolated or random phenomena. They appear in many different caves across a wide geographical range spanning tens of thousands of years. In places like Chauvet or Lascaux, alongside animal drawings observed and recreated with high precision, researchers still find geometric signs repeated deliberately. That repetition shows that these signs were remembered, recreated, and recognized by others within the same community. A single stroke could be accidental. A lone dot could be only a test mark. A curve appearing once might not carry any intention beyond the moment of drawing. But when such signs appear again and again in similar forms, placed in familiar ways across different caves, through many generations, the likelihood of accident begins to vanish. Correct repetition indicates memory. Memory indicates learning. And learning, when maintained within a community, creates a convention. That convention does not depend on an image resembling the object it represents. A stroke does not need to look like anything. A sequence of dots does not need to evoke a familiar picture. Their meaning is not contained in the shape itself, but in the fact that they are recognized and repeated in the same way. This is the crucial point. A convention exists only when many people share it. It does not have to be spoken aloud. It does not have to be explained each time. It only has to be recognized as correct. And that is what distinguishes abstract patterns from every form of image making that came before. However, one thing must be emphasized. These patterns do not carry a universal meaning that we can decode today. There is no alphabet to compare against, no dictionary to consult, no accompanying text to explain the original intention of the people who made them. Modern archaeology is very cautious here, because any attempt to assign those signs a fixed, clear meaning that can be translated into modern language carries the risk of imposing our thinking onto a very different world of thought. We do not know exactly what each sign meant, and more importantly, we should not pretend that we do. These patterns are not lost writing. They are not messages waiting to be deciphered. They are not ancient codes awaiting a single key to unlock them. They are traces of a way of thinking, not records of a specific content. The fact that we do not clearly understand their original meaning does not diminish their value. On the contrary, it reminds us that what matters most here is not what they say, but how humans learn to use signs. At that time, humans did not yet need a system that could be translated into speech. They needed a way to preserve order, to remember what could not always be seen, and to pass on understandings that exceeded personal experience. Abstract patterns met that need not through absolute clarity, but through the stability of convention. They exist not because they are easy for everyone to understand, but because they were familiar enough to those who needed to understand them. And the maintenance of that familiarity is the earliest sign of symbolic thinking beginning to function at the level of a community. But what we can understand very clearly is the kind of thinking required to create them. To draw a bison, humans had to observe the world, remember shape, movement, and proportion. But to draw an abstract sign, they had to do something else, separate meaning from image. A zigzag is not a snake. A string of dots is not a herd. A grid shape is not a cave. These signs are meaningful only if the viewer has been taught how to read them. This is the moment symbolic thought appears, when an image no longer needs to resemble what it represents, when the link between sign and meaning does not rely on visual similarity, but on sharing and agreement within a community. An abstract pattern works only if it is shared. If only one person understands it, it is meaningless. If the whole group understands it, it becomes a tool. These patterns often appear in locations that are not easy to reach. Not at the cave entrance, not in spaces of everyday living. They lie deep in darkness where natural light never reaches. To see them, humans had to carry fire, had to stop, had to spend time. This suggests they did not serve immediate needs like navigation or hunting. They belonged to another rhythm of life, the slow rhythm of memory, order, and contemplation. Some hypotheses suggest these abstract patterns may relate to counting remembering cycles or marking repeating events in nature. Perhaps the migration cycles of herds. Perhaps the rhythm of the seasons. Perhaps intervals tied to birth maturity or loss. These hypotheses are not pure imagination. They are based on the repetition of signs, the way they are arranged, and the places they appear within cave space. However, none of these hypotheses can be confirmed with certainty. We have no direct evidence linking a specific sign to a specific meaning. There is no explanatory text, no living tradition surviving into the present to compare against. And so archaeology must stop at the threshold of interpretation that goes too far. But at that stopping point, something more important begins to appear. The core issue is not what these patterns represent in terms of content. What matters is that humans began to believe meaning could exist without needing a concrete image to cling to. That a simple sign, if repeated and shared in the right way, could carry more than what it shows to the naked eye. That is an enormous leap in thinking. Before this, human memory was tightly bound to place. The cave was where images were stored. The rock wall was a surface of remembering. To remember, humans had to return to the same space stand in the same position and see the same image again. Memory existed as part of the landscape. But with abstract patterns, that relationship begins to change. Memory no longer depends entirely on seeing an image that resembles the outside world. It begins to be encoded. A simple sign can stand for a long chain of experience, a repeating rule, or an idea that cannot be seen, something with no shape, no color, and no way to be recreated, simply by drawing it again. Here, the image is no longer a copy of the world. It becomes a tool of memory. A small sign can contain more layers of understanding than its shape alone, not because it is mysterious, but because it sits within a shared system. The viewer does not need to relive the original experience. They only need to recognize the sign, and memory is automatically activated. This opens an entirely new possibility, Memory is no longer limited by the lifespan of one individual or the presence of one location. It can be transmitted, maintained, and reactivated by people who never experienced the original event. And from that moment, human memory begins to move beyond the present. No longer only what happened here, but what is always true, what will return, what must be remembered, even when it is not visible. Abstract patterns, therefore, are not simply a form of difficult art. They are signs that humans began to believe the world could be organized by ideas, not only by direct experience. And once that belief appears, it does not disappear. It becomes the invisible foundation for every later form of knowledge, from tradition to law to collective memory, and eventually to civilization. This opens the ability to think about what is not present, about time, not yet arrived, about cycles, not yet repeated, about invisible forces shaping human life. Abstract patterns do not need to be beautiful, and they do not need to be easy to understand. They only need to be correct within a shared logic. And once that logic is established, it can survive even after the maker is gone. Here we can see a profound shift. From recording the outer world, humans begin to organize the inner world. No longer only what we see, but what we understand. No longer only images, but systems. Abstract patterns are not writing, but they lay the groundwork for the idea that memory can be placed outside the brain in a form that others can receive, without needing the original experience. That is the foundation of every later system of knowledge. When we place these patterns beside handprints and human figurines, a developmental sequence becomes clear from "I was here" to "we want to keep living," and then to "we understand the world through a structure." This is not a rapid advance. It is a slow process, scattered across time, but irreversible. And it is here, long before writing, long before cities or agriculture, that humans made a decisive step. They began to think beyond the present. When humans began to draw signs that no longer resembled anything in the natural world, when memory was encoded through patterns and convention, a new limit gradually came into view. Images, no matter how abstract they became, were still bound to space. They needed a surface. They needed light. They needed someone to return to the same place in order to be seen. But prehistoric life did not allow that kind of permanence to last. People moved. Groups dissolved and reformed. Places were visited and then abandoned. And there were experiences, feelings, rhythms, collective moments that could not be anchored to a rock wall. In those moments, images began to be not enough. Sound emerged as another possibility. Not to store, but to spread. Not to stand still, but to move. It needed no surface, only space and bodies. In the prehistoric world, sound was not a late invention. It was always there. Footsteps whined sliding through cracks, and stone animals calling to one another at night. Human voices calling across distance. But at a very early point, humans did not only hear sound, they began to create it deliberately. Archaeological evidence shows that the earliest musical instruments appeared very early in the late Upper Paleolithic. They were not the accidental products of random tinkering, but the result of purposeful choices. Flutes were made from bird bone, mammoth ivory, or animal bone materials hard enough to hold shape, hollow enough to carry sound. On their surfaces, holes were carved at intentionally varied distances, allowing different pitches when blown. This shows that the makers were not merely concerned with producing sound, but with differences between sounds. One of the most representative artifacts is the Hohlfels flute, dated to more than 40,000 years ago. It appears within the same time horizon as the earliest cave paintings we know. These two forms of expression, image and sound, did not follow one another in a simple evolutionary sequence. They existed at the same time, like two different answers to the same need to make shared experience something that could be shared and remembered. This is not a coincidence. To create an instrument capable of pitch, humans had to do more than listen. They had to experiment. They had to recognize that changing the position of a whole would change the sound. They had to remember the relationship between an object's form and what the ear receives. That is a form of cause and effect thinking, abstract, repeatable, very similar to the thinking that produced abstract patterns on cave walls. Sound, like abstract pattern, does not need to resemble the world in order to carry meaning. A musical note does not stand for any animal. A melody does not imitate a hunt or the movement of a herd. Sound does not tell in the way images do. It acts. The meaning of sound lies in the shared experience it creates in the moment. When a tone rises inside the enclosed space of a cave, it covers everyone present. No one can stand outside it. No one can only look without also hearing. Sound creates a field of shared experience where bodies vibrate together, attend together, adjust breath and movement together. Unlike images, sound does not exist independently of time. It is born, and then it fades. It forces those who participate to remain inside the moment. And for that reason, sound becomes a special medium for creating synchrony. Synchrony of attention, synchrony of feeling, and sometimes synchrony of action. In a mobile community where there is no fixed space to return to sound, carries an obvious advantage. It does not need a surface. It does not need light. It does not need long-term material storage. An instrument can be carried. A melody can be held inside the body. A rhythm can be recreated anywhere as long as there are people and space. Here sound becomes mobile memory. Not memory placed on stone, but memory placed into human capacity for recreation. Once a melody is learned, it no longer depends on the first person who made it. It can be passed on through imitation repetition, direct participation. Its meaning does not reside in the instrument itself, but in the relationship among the people who create it together and hear it together. This places sound alongside abstract pattern at an essential point. Both require a shared convention. An abstract sign has meaning only if others understand it. A melody is only right if others recognize it and carry it forward. There is no passive audience, only participants. And so when instruments appear so early in the archaeological record, they do not merely tell us that humans knew how to make sound. They tell us that humans were ready to invest time, skill, and material into experiences that did not directly help them hunt or gather food, but helped keep the community bonded and held within a common rhythm. In a world that was always uncertain, where images could be left behind, sound allowed meaning to move with people. And when sound joined abstract image, art was no longer only a trace of what had happened. It became a way for humans to be together in the present, with a sense of order and connection that required no words. Unlike images, sound exists in time. It begins, changes, then disappears. It cannot be kept and viewed later. But that very impermanence makes it suited to a mobile life. Sound can be carried in memory, recreated through bodies, and shared instantly with those nearby. In a prehistoric group, a rhythmic sound could synchronize movement. A simple melody could create shared attention. A repeated sequence of tones could mark a moment, beginning, ending, transition. Here, art is no longer only something seen. It becomes something heard, felt, and participated in. The body is no longer a passive observer. It becomes an instrument. Breath creates sound. Heartbeat merges into rhythm. Hands strike feet, step voices rise and echo back in cave space. Many caves with ancient paintings also possess distinctive acoustic qualities. Areas with strong echo, extended reverberation, or clear resonance often coincide with places showing symbolic activity. This does not prove that the paintings were made for listening, but it suggests that humans were highly sensitive to how space responds to sound. Sound, then, was not merely a form of entertainment. It was a way to create collective presence. An image can be seen by one person. A sound truly exists only when many people hear it together. In a prehistoric context where group cohesion was a condition of survival, the ability to create moments of shared rhythm, shared hearing, shared feeling, carried deep value. Sound leaves no clear material trace the way images do, but it leaves traces in social memory. It is not accidental that the earliest instruments are not complex. They do not require high technique to play. They require repetition, rhythm, basic pitch. What matters is not performance, but recreation, so that anyone in the group can learn and participate. Here, art takes another step from symbol to simultaneous experience. Images allow humans to think beyond the present. Sound allows humans to be together within the present. And when these two meet, abstract image and rhythmic sound art is no longer only a tool for remembering. It becomes a medium for organizing community, not through law, not through command, but through a felt sense of connection. When sound enters human symbolic life, a boundary begins to blur. It is the boundary between making art and participating in art. An image can be seen from a distance. Sound cannot. It surrounds. It touches the body. And when many people listen together, breathe together, become quiet together, art begins to move beyond the individual and become a collective act. In the enclosed spaces of caves, sound does not merely rise and vanish. It rebounds. It extends. It bends along stone walls. There are points where echo is stronger, where a note lasts longer, where even a small tap is enough for the cave to answer. Prehistoric humans did not need measurement to notice this. They could feel it in the body. And wherever the body felt it most clearly, that place became a point of gathering. Evidence of overlap between acoustically powerful spaces and signs of symbolic activity suggests that humans did not only hear sound, they chose where to make sound. Not every corner of a cave is the same. Some places invite reverberation. Some places hold silence. To stop at a point, establish rhythm, then let the cave respond, is an experience beyond communication or entertainment. It produces the sensation of being held inside an order. In that moment, art is no longer an object or a trace. It is a process, a sequence of actions unfolding in time. The blowing, the striking, the silence between beats, the waiting, and then the sound returning. Those present are no longer scattered individuals. They are drawn into the same rhythm, the same cycle of attention. And that very synchrony gives rise to what we can call early ritual, not in the sense of a fixed religion, but as a repeated pattern of shared action. Ritual at this stage does not require explanation. It does not require a name. It only needs to be done again. A familiar rhythm, a familiar sequence, a familiar sensation at the end. When an action is repeated in the same way, in the same space by many people, it creates a temporal marker different from the everyday time of survival. This time is not measured by hunger and fullness, by day and night, but by beginning and ending tension, and release silence and resonance. Sound plays a central role in this shift because it forces the body to participate. One cannot watch a sound ritual without being pulled in. Rhythm draws movement. Movement draws breath. Breath draws feeling. And when feeling is shared, the community becomes briefly one body. Here, art is not meant to transmit information. It creates conditions. Conditions for humans to step out together from the fragmented rhythm of hunting, moving, staying alert. Conditions for them to step into a structured moment where everyone knows when to begin, when to wait, when to end, even if no one says it aloud. The image on cave walls, the sound in space, and the participating human body form a three-dimensional structure that cannot be separated. Each element carries its own function, but only when they appear together does art reach a role beyond leaving traces. The image fixed on stone anchors memory to place. It binds experience to a specific space, a stable surface where humans can return and see what once happened. Memory in this form does not drift. It stands still and waits. Sound is different. It does not stand still and it does not wait. Sound extends experience through time, creating a sequence participants must move through. When rhythm rises and stops, when echo stretches and fades, humans listen not only with ears, but with the whole of their attention. Sound demands that the moment be fully lived, because once missed, it will not return in the same way. For this reason, sound makes time itself a component of art, inseparable from the experience. Between these two elements stands the human body. The body is where the image is seen and where sound is felt. It receives and it responds. Standing before a painting, the body situates itself in space. Hearing a rhythm, the body adjusts, breath, posture, movement. The body is not merely a passive observer. It is the medium through which art is recreated. An image can be seen again, a sound can be repeated, but only through living bodies. When these three meet, art is no longer only a way to recall the past. It becomes a template of action. Humans do not return only to look, but to do. Not only to hear, but to participate. Artistic experience, therefore, produces a familiar sequence, arriving at a certain place, entering a certain space, making sound in a certain way, allowing the body to merge into that rhythm. Within that sequence, collective life is briefly reorganized. Roles of survival recede for a moment. Hunter-gatherer, child, elder, all stand inside a shared structure of experience. Not by command or spoken rule, but by simultaneous participation. Art here becomes a way for the community to arrange itself without explanation. This is especially important in a prehistoric context, with no calendars, no writing, and no stable institutions. When image, sound, and body operate together, they create markers of time different from daily life. These markers are not measured in days or seasons, but in repeated experience. And it is precisely that structured repetition that helps humans feel order inside an unstable world. So art does not merely record what happened. It teaches humans how to be together. It creates a space where memory, emotion, and action converge. And from that moment, art is no longer the trace of an individual. It becomes a quiet tool for sustaining and shaping collective life. The important point is, this early ritual does not require supernatural belief in order to exist. It does not need stories of invisible powers. It only needs dependable repetition. When a community knows that the same sequence will occur, that the same feeling will return, they gain something prehistoric life rarely offered: predictability. And that predictability, even brief, creates a sense of safety. From sound to ritual is a subtle transition. There is no single moment of invention. Only the accumulation of repeated times of listening together, doing together, remembering together. But once that shift occurs, art is no longer only the product of an individual mind. It becomes the emotional infrastructure of the community, the the thing that helps humans stand together inside uncertainty. At this point, art has accomplished what a single image or abstract sign can rarely accomplish alone. It binds. Not through command, not through law, but through rhythm and participation. And from those early rituals, humans learned how to create shared order, the precondition for every later form of social organization. In a world without writing, without calendars, without systematized ceremonies, sound marked time in another way through bodily rhythm. Through the repetition of breath and movement. Through memory carved not into stone, but into shared experience. And here we can see something clearly. When images were no longer enough to hold what mattered most, humans turned to sound. Not to replace, but to complement. Not to record, but to live together with. When art moved beyond the scale of an individual trace and became a collective act, it began to take on a role far deeper than preserving memory or expressing emotion. In the prehistoric world where there were no written laws, no political institutions, no systems of education, and no recorded history, art gradually became a social tool, a quiet medium through which humans organized shared life, maintained cohesion, and softened tensions that could not be resolved with words. To understand this role, we have to return art to its proper context, not as an activity separate from life, but as something embedded deep within the survival structure of the human species. Hunter-gatherer communities did not live in large, stable societies with dense populations and surplus resources. They existed in small groups, often only a few dozen people, moving continuously with the seasons, with herds, and with the capacities of the surrounding environment. In such groups, no one could survive alone for long. Finding food, defending against predators, caring for the sick, or raising children all required coordination. Each individual depended directly on others, not only materially, but psychologically. To feel cut off from the group was to face a very real risk of death, but that dependence also carried tension. When resources were scarce, when weather turned harsh, when illness or loss struck, relationships between individuals were easily strained. There was no legal mechanism to settle disputes. There was no centralized power strong enough to enforce long-term order by force. The group's survival depended on its ability to self-correct, to repair itself, and to rebuild trust after inevitable fractures. In a world like this, anything that strengthened cohesion held life or death value. Yet cohesion could not rest only on short-term advantage. It had to be continually nurtured through means that did not produce direct confrontation and did not intensify individual differences. Art answered precisely that need through shared images, repeated sounds, and familiar sequences of action. Art created moments in which people could coexist without competing. It did not solve hunger or thirst immediately, but it created conditions that allowed the group to keep cooperating over the long run. In those moments, people were not merely hunters, gatherers, or caretakers. They were members of a collective sharing one experience. That is why art was not a luxury that appeared only after survival needs were satisfied. On the contrary, it was part of survival strategy. It helped humans maintain relationships durable enough to endure trial. In this context, art did not merely reflect prehistoric society. It helped that society continue to exist. Art entered precisely into that gap. An image painted in a cave was not merely the product of observation or personal creativity. It became a shared point of reference. When many people knew the same image, returned to the same spot, and recognized the same familiar lines, they shared a portion of collective memory. That memory belonged to no single person, but it was not anonymous either. It existed in the relationship among those who acknowledged it together. More importantly, that memory did not need to be explained again each time. It did not require words. It required only presence. When someone new was brought into a painted space, they did not need to be told the whole story. They only needed to be led to the right place to stand in the right position and to look. Seeing the same image others had seen before was enough to create a sense of belonging. Sound and ritual made that sharing even more alive. When a sequence of action was repeated, same rhythm, same space, same silences, the community did not merely remember, it practiced memory. Each repetition confirmed that the group still existed, that a shared order was still recognized. No declaration was needed. No command was required. Participation was enough. Here, art began to do something very distinctive. It created moments of temporary equality. In everyday life, each person held a different role. The more skilled hunter carried more prestige. Elders carried more experience. Children depended on adults. But in the space of art, where image, sound, and ritual converged, those differences quieted for a while. Everyone became a participant. Everyone listened, watched, waited, and ended together. This temporary equality did not erase social structure, but it softened it. It created a space where tension could be released without direct confrontation. In communities without formal punishment, mechanisms, the ability to reduce conflict without splitting the group was crucial. In this way, art became a kind of social pressure valve. It is not accidental that many forms of prehistoric art demanded coordination. A melody needs many people to hold the beat. A ritual requires someone to begin, someone to follow, someone to wait their turn. These sequences taught humans how to pay attention to one another, how to adjust individual action to a shared rhythm. This was not survival skill in the immediate sense, but it was foundational social skill. Children learn these skills early, not through direct instruction, but through being present in spaces shaped by art. When led into a cave, when standing among adults, preparing, when hearing familiar sounds begin to rise, they were not required to understand. They only needed to watch. And that repeated watching gradually formed awareness. They learned when to be silent, not because someone signaled a prohibition, but because the space itself demanded a settling down. They learned when to wait, when a rhythm had not yet finished, when a silence was being held. And they learned when they could join when sound opened up, when movement became synchronized, when the adults around them were ready. These lessons were not tied to clear rewards or punishments. They were not explained as concepts. Instead, they were felt through the body. Children learned by adjusting their breathing to the shared rhythm, by copying posture, by recognizing the difference between the moments when one must stay still and the moments when one can move. Over time, these patterns became reflex, an embodied form of understanding that did not require conscious thought. Because they were learned this way, these social skills became far more durable than spoken knowledge. They did not depend on deliberate memory. They lived in habit, in the felt sense of what is right or not right when entering a collective situation. And as children grew, they did not need to be taught again from the beginning. Their bodies already knew what to do. Over time, these repeated experiences accumulated and became what we can call tradition, even without a name, and without being recognized as an abstract concept. Tradition in this context was not a story repeated word for word across generations. It was an action template, a familiar sequence maintained long enough to become self-evident. When a community knows that we do this way, it gains a stable anchor in a world that is always shifting. That anchor is not located in a promise or a written rule, but in the certainty that when the time comes, everyone will know what to do, where to stand, and how long to wait. In an unpredictable environment, that certainty provides a rare sense of safety. Tradition in this sense did not freeze prehistoric society. It did not prevent change, but it created a stable baseline that allowed change to happen without dissolving the community. Action templates could be adjusted, added to reduced or replaced over time. Yet, having a template to begin with meant the group did not need to rebuild everything from zero after every shock. And when these traditions were maintained across generations, they did something even more important. They tied the past to the present. Children, by entering familiar sequences, did not only learn how to act, they stepped into a current that existed before they were born. They did not need to know who began it. They did not need to know what the original reason was. It was enough to know that by doing it, they were becoming part of something larger than themselves. From these wordless traditions, prehistoric communities preserved continuity. And that continuity is the quiet foundation for every more complex form of society that would appear later. Art as a social tool also helped define the boundary of a community, not through fences or explicit symbols, but through familiarity. Whoever knew how to participate with the right rhythm and the right sequence belonged. Whoever did not recognize the familiar sign stood outside. This boundary was soft. It could open to newcomers, but it still existed. And its existence allowed a community to maintain identity without an abstract concept of us and them. What is striking is that art does not impose. It does not coerce participation. But in a small group, not participating can mean removing oneself from the shared current. And so art encourages consensus not through command, but through the pull of togetherness. People participate because they want to belong, not because they are forced. In this way, art became an early form of social technology. It did not manufacture material tools. It manufactured coordination. It helped many different individuals act as a group, at least in crucial moments. In a world full of risk, that capacity was as valuable as hunting skill or the ability to find food. Art also helped sustain shared memory over time, not by storing detailed information, but by preserving familiarity. When a ritual is repeated after many years, the feeling that this has happened before forms a thread between generations. Participants do not need to know who began it. It is enough to know they are stepping into a current that existed before they were born. That feeling, the feeling of belonging to something longer than the self, is the foundation of all later social complexity. Before law, before legitimized authority, humans needed a way to feel that they were part of something larger. Art provided that feeling through experience, not through concept. At this stage, art did not sit at the edges of life. It stood at the center of how humans learned to live together. It did not solve every problem, but it created necessary pauses, moments in which a community could look back at itself, adjust itself, and continue. And from those pauses, more durable social structures slowly formed. When humans became accustomed to gathering, repeating, and recognizing shared templates, they already held the foundational elements for ritual, for tradition, and later for civilization. Art, in its social role, was not decoration on the human story. It was one of the quietest but most persistent foundations of how humans became a species that lives together. There is one thing that is very easy to overlook when we look back at the long history of humankind. For most of the time that Homo sapiens has existed, human life did not unfold in villages. There were no permanent houses, no clear boundary between staying and moving, no concept of homeland as a fixed point on a map. For tens of thousands of years, humans lived in a world where place itself was temporary. Caves, rock shelters, riverbanks, valleys, all were stopping points, not destinations. They were used when conditions allowed, when herds remained nearby, when water sources had not yet dried up, when the weather had not turned. And then they were left behind, not because memory faded, but because the environment required people to move on. Living space for most of this history was not built to last. It was used for a short phase, a season, a cycle, and then yielded to the next movement. In such a way of life, everything was fluid. Sleeping places changed. Paths changed. Even relationships had to adapt to continuous movement. Nothing was guaranteed to remain when people returned. And for that reason, most traces of everyday life disappeared, quickly erased by rain-wind time and the reclaiming force of nature. And it was within this temporary world that art appeared very early. Images were placed on stone, not on materials easy to carry, but on hard surfaces resistant to change. Sounds rose and faded, leaving no physical trace, yet imprinting themselves on those who heard them together. Rituals were performed and completed, not lasting indefinitely, but long enough to create a shared experience. At first glance, art seems just as temporary as everything else. A painting does not travel with people when they leave a cave. A melody exists only in the moment it is played. A ritual cannot last forever. But what is remarkable is this art tends to endure in ways fundamentally different from material life. People move on, but images remain. The marks on stone do not travel with the group, but they wait. They preserve a fragment of experience, not for the one who made them, but for those who may return later. Over time, these images no longer belong to a single moment or individual. They become layers of accumulated memory bound to the space itself. Sound fades, but memory of rhythm is carried forward. A melody does not need stone walls to survive. It is held in memory, in the body, in the regulation of breath. When people move to a new place, that rhythm can be recreated similar or slightly transformed, yet still carrying the familiarity of previous occasions. Rituals end, but their sequences are etched into the body. When a chain of actions is repeated often enough, it no longer needs conscious recall. The body knows what comes next. In this sense, ritual is the most mobile of all. It depends not on material, but on people themselves. This difference creates a deep paradox. While human life was highly mobile, art generated elements of stability. Not physical stability, but stability of meaning. Art allowed parts of experience to persist across the breaks caused by movement. Where images remain, a place is no longer entirely accidental. Where rhythm is remembered, a place is no longer entirely unfamiliar. Where rituals once occurred, a space carries an invisible layer of order. In this way, art began doing something extraordinarily subtle. It connected scattered moments into continuity. It allowed people to leave without having to begin entirely from zero when they returned. And from this ability, the relationship between humans and place slowly changed from passing through to survive to returning because of meaning. In a world where everything could disappear after a single season, art became one of the few things capable of staying, not by resisting time, but by being carried, remembered, and recreated. And this quiet form of remaining laid the groundwork for a much larger shift. Humans began to attach themselves to certain places, not only because of survival conditions, but because of what had been lived there. Here a crucial paradox begins to emerge. While the material life of humans remained mobile, their symbolic life grew increasingly stable. Caves, therefore, were not merely shelters from weather or predators. They became anchors, not anchoring people physically, but anchoring memory, meaning, and social order. When a community returned to the same cave across generations, it was not because that cave was more convenient than all others, but because it carried accumulated meaning. Old images no longer belonged to those who painted them, but to us. Ritual sequences performed there distinguished that space from all others. In this sense, caves became the first social locations, not permanent residences, but places of return. The act of returning was essential. It created a new form of stability, not based on architecture or agriculture, but on collective memory bound to space. When people knew we have been here before, they began to see space not merely as a resource, but as part of group history. From that moment, the relationship between humans and place changed. Space was no longer neutral. It carried traces, and those traces began to influence decisions to return or to leave. Over a very long time, such anchor points multiplied. At first, it might be a cave visited a few times. Later, a riverbank where herds often passed. A valley where the wind was less harsh in winter. A water source that did not dry up, even in difficult seasons. No place became important by chance. Each was selected through repeated experience, through survival failure and safe return. Space began to accumulate memory, and each return reinforced that memory with another layer. What had once been accidental became familiar. Small details, slippery paths, deep river bends, rocks that blocked wind no longer needed rediscovery. They were remembered, transmitted, and embedded in how people moved through that space. This familiarity was not vague sentiment or nostalgia. It had concrete consequences. In familiar places, people could move without constant probing. They knew when to travel during the day, which areas to avoid during heavy rain, which paths to take when carrying children or the weak. Familiar space allowed conservation of energy, a crucial factor in prehistoric survival. In familiar places, people knew shelter, not just where to hide from rain, but where it was safe to rest, to heal, to wait. Such shelters did not need construction. They needed recognition and memory. And when a community shared memory of safe shelters, decisions to stop or continue carried less risk. In familiar places, people knew danger. Space was read not only positively. Threats were remembered as well: fast currents, narrow passages prone to ambush unstable cliffs. Foreknowledge prevented repeated mistakes, reducing unnecessary loss and contributing to group stability. In familiar places, people knew where to gather. In moments of separation, waiting, or regrouping, there were tacitly agreed points. No signs were required. They existed in shared memory. Each use reinforced them further. When art ritual and tradition became attached to these familiar places, space ceased to be mere survival context. It became part of social life. A cave with paintings was not only physically safe, it was meaningful. A riverbank linked to ritual provided not only water, but a sense of order. In this context, staying longer or returning sooner became easier. Not because people suddenly desired permanence, but because familiar places reduced uncertainty. They allowed extended presence without proportional increase in risk. Over time, this extension produced small but cumulative changes. Tools left behind because we will return. Shelters lightly reinforced because next year we will need them. Paths cleared because children will pass through. Each act was small, but repeated across generations, they transformed stopping points into places. From these familiar places, the concept of settlement slowly emerged, not as a revolutionary decision, but as a natural outcome of living in a world where space had acquired memory, order, and meaning. This happened very slowly. There was no moment when settlement began, no clear boundary between nomadic and sedentary life. Instead, over thousands of years, familiar stopping points gradually extended duration of stay from days to weeks to seasons. Eventually, some places were no longer fully abandoned. Here, art played a quiet yet decisive role. A place with symbolic meaning is not easily relinquished. When a site is bound to ritual ancestral memory and collective experience, leaving becomes more than an ecological decision. It carries loss. And that faint sense of loss early on helped keep people in place just a little longer. As stays lengthened, other changes followed. Tools repaired on site rather than carried. Shelters temporarily reinforced. Objects left for the next return. These small, repeated actions formed the preconditions of settlement, not as sudden invention, but as natural consequence of increasing attachment to particular places. And when settlement began to take shape, art did not disappear. It changed roles. In a mobile world, art held communities together briefly. In a semi-sedentary world, art began organizing living space. Images moved closer to daily activity. Sound marked rhythms of life beginnings and endings of seasons, arrivals and departures. Art no longer only anchored memory to place. It began shaping place itself. Locations were chosen not only for water or food, but for compatibility with established patterns of living patterns learned earlier in caves' rituals' shared experience. Thus, when humans entered clearer phases of settlement, they did not begin from zero. They carried a social toolkit honed over long time, the ability to gather, to repeat shared actions, to attach meaning to space. Caves seen this way were not crude precursors of villages. They were not unfinished versions of houses or roads. Such comparisons miss their most important contribution. Caves did not teach humans how to build. They taught humans how to stay not bodily, but through memory and meaning. They were the first school of spatially grounded social life. A school without walls, lectures, or teachers. Lessons transmitted through repetition of experience. There, humans learned how to return. Returning was not merely physical, it was cognitive. Choosing to return acknowledged that the past mattered, that what happened there was worth continuing. Return created a temporal axis, present layered upon previous presence. There, humans learned how to remember. Not by recounting events, but through traces, images on stone echoes in darkness, rhythms of repeated actions. Memory was distributed across space, body, and collective participation. There, humans learned how to act together in one place, not only for survival, but for social order. Coordination arose not from command, but from familiarity and trust. These lessons did not vanish when humans left caves. They were carried, repeated, adapted elsewhere. As humans stayed longer in certain locations, cave-learned skills became crucial, returning shared memory, collective action. Thus, settlement was enabled not only by agriculture or architecture. Food and shelter were necessary, but without the ability to live together in fixed space, to manage tension, share memory, sustain belonging, they could not flourish. Art was never peripheral. It was not decoration added after stability. It was present early, quietly weaving connections between people and place. Through images, memory was bound to space. Through sound and ritual, people were bound to time and to one another. Through repetition, past and present were joined without explanation. From caves to settlement, then, is not merely a story of technique or ecology. It is a story of meaning and of how humans learn to remain in the world, not only through bodies, but through shared memory. There is a question that seems simple at first, yet it touches the core of this entire journey. Why didn't ancient art disappear? Not because stone lasts longer than hide or wood, not because caves protect better from rain and wind, and not because prehistoric humans wanted to leave a legacy in the modern sense, an idea that only truly emerges once people have written history a concept of fame, and a sense of time extending far beyond a single lifetime. If we look only at materials, most ancient art should have vanished. People painted in darkness with crude mineral powders mixed with water fat or other natural binders, fragile substances. These images were not sealed or coated. They were not regularly repaired. They faced mold bacteria, geological movement, and the slow, unforgiving work of time. Musical instruments were made from bone, ivory, antler, wood, and other organic materials that crack, decay, and fracture with ease. They were shaped by hand without standardized measurements, without protective coatings, without any expectation of permanence. These instruments were not stored in controlled environments. They were exposed to moisture temperature shifts, bacteria, and repeated use. They traveled with people across landscapes, were played until they weakened, then were left behind, broken or repurposed. Most of them did not survive even a single human lifetime. Ritual, an essential component of prehistoric art, was even more fragile. It left almost nothing that could endure materially. No permanent buildings, no written instructions, no fixed objects designed to last beyond the moment of use. A ritual existed only while it was being performed in bodies moving together, in voices rising and falling in shared attention, focused on the same sequence of actions. When it ended, it vanished physically. What remained was not a thing, but an imprint carried in memory and habit, in the expectation that it would happen again. And humans lived in a world where nature had time, vast amounts of it, to erase everything. Rain seeped into stone, ice expanded and fractured surfaces, floods rearranged entire landscapes, landslides buried caves, climate shifts transformed forests into grasslands and grasslands into deserts. There was no stable background against which fragile cultural traces could safely accumulate. Over tens of thousands of years, even the most durable natural formations were reshaped or destroyed. In such a world, the delicate byproducts of human creativity, powdered pigments, soft sounds, fleeting gestures, should have disappeared completely. If ancient art had existed only as material output, it would not have survived. It would have been erased not by catastrophe, but by accumulation, the slow, patient layering of natural processes that leave no room for fragile things to remain intact. And yet traces remain. This tells us something crucial. What endured was not the material form itself, but the system that continually brought it back into being. Ancient art did not depend on preservation. It depended on repetition, on return, on reactivation. Each time a sound was played again, each time a gesture was repeated, each time an image was recognized and responded to, art re-entered the present. In a world where matter failed, memory carried forward. In a world where objects decayed, practice persisted. In a world where nothing stayed still, meaning learned how to move. This is why ancient art reached us at all, not because it resisted nature, but because it aligned itself with the only thing capable of crossing such spans of time, human continuity itself. And yet ancient art is still here, not only as surviving objects, paintings, handprints, rare fragments of instruments. More importantly, it continues as an unbroken current in the way humans create meaning. A current not cut off, even when forms change. Spaces change, and societies change. This reveals a basic truth. The core of ancient art does not lie in material. It lies in how art was used, repeated, and integrated into social life. Art was not created to remain on its own. It was created to be returned to, reenacted, and participated in. A painting on stone becomes meaningful only when someone returns to look at it, stands before it, and recognizes that they are stepping into a space once marked by human presence. A melody truly exists only when someone else hears it, remembers it, and plays it again in their own way. A ritual lives only when it is repeated, not necessarily identically, only familiar enough to be recognized. In that sense, ancient art does not exist as an object forgotten in the past. It exists as a process that is continually reactivated. Each time it is performed again, it steps out of the past and into the present. And it is this continual return that prevents it from disappearing. So, when we say ancient art still exists, we do not mean it resisted time through physical durability. It exists because it found another way to endure by attaching itself to humans, to collective memory, to patterns of action passed from one generation to the next. Stone can erode, bone can rot, caves can collapse. But as long as humans return, remember, and recreate, then art in its deepest form continues to be present. Not as a motionless ruin, but as a quiet current that finds a way through time by the most human need of all the need to create meaning and to share it with others. To understand why we have to return to a foundational truth, ancient art was not made to survive as an object. It was made to survive as a relationship between humans and place, a relationship between humans and one another, a relationship between the present and memory. When an image is painted on stone, its value is not measured by how long the pigment endures, but by whether people return to it. A painting truly lives only when someone stands before it, recognizes it, and places themselves into the same stream of experience. The act of return completes the image. Without that return, the image is reduced to colored mineral on rock, present, but empty of meaning. In this sense, meaning does not reside in the image alone. It emerges in the relationship between image place and the people who encounter it. The stone holds a trace, but the trace requires recognition to become active. A painted wall that is never revisited does not function as art in the ancient sense. It becomes a silent surface, disconnected from the cycle that once gave it purpose. This way of understanding art is profoundly different from how we tend to think about it today. Modern art is typically separated from everyday living space. It is removed from kitchens, sleeping areas, and paths of daily movement. It is placed in museums, galleries, archives, spaces designed to isolate it from ordinary use. It is preserved behind glass controlled for humidity and light protected from touch. The object is stabilized, frozen in time, and shielded from change. Modern art is also tightly bound to individual authorship. Names are attached, dates are recorded, provenance is tracked. Value accumulates through originality, rarity, and endurance. The longer an object survives unchanged, the more valuable it is considered to be. Preservation becomes the primary goal, and interaction becomes secondary. In this framework, the artwork is expected to remain complete even without repeated engagement. It can be admired once documented and then left behind without losing its status. Its meaning is assumed to be contained within the object itself, independent of continued participation. Ancient art functioned in the opposite way. It was not isolated from life. It was not protected from change. It was not designed to stand alone. Its meaning depended on return, on repetition, on re-entry. An image mattered because people came back to it because it remained part of a lived landscape, encountered again and again across time. Each return did not simply confirm the image, it reactivated it. The painting was not complete at the moment it was made. It was completed repeatedly each time someone stood before it and recognized its place within a shared history. Because of this, ancient images were never fully finished. They remained open, capable of being reinterpreted, added to, layered over, or simply re-experienced from a different moment in the community's life. Their value lay not in permanence of form, but in continuity of engagement. Where modern art seeks to stop time, ancient art learned how to move with it. The stone wall might remain, but its significance shifted subtly with each generation. New people encountered old images not as static relics, but as active participants in an ongoing conversation, one that did not require explanation, authorship, or documentation. Recognition itself was enough. In that sense, ancient art did not aim to survive unchanged. It aimed to remain meaningful. And meaning, unlike material, cannot be preserved once and for all. It must be returned to re-entered and lived again. This difference is not simply stylistic. It reflects two fundamentally different relationships between humans, objects, and time. One seeks to hold the past still. The other allows the past to stay present by letting it be revisited. And it is this second relationship, the one built on return rather than preservation, that allowed ancient art to endure across vast stretches of time long after the hands that created it had vanished. Ancient art is the opposite. It is not separated from life. It does not stand alone. It only gains meaning within a chain of actions and experiences that are repeated. That is why ancient art does not vanish when people leave. Because the most important part of it does not remain behind. Rhythm is carried in the body. Ritual sequence is written into reflex. Ways of gathering, ways of being silent, ways of beginning and ending these move with people. Images on stone may wear away. Instruments may break. Spaces may collapse. But the social patterns created by art do not disappear easily. A community that has learned to gather around a shared experience will keep finding ways to gather, even when forms change. A group that has learned to bind memory to space will keep finding ways to mark place, even when it is no longer a cave. A society that has learned to create order through ritual will continue to create ritual, even when symbols and meanings transform. In that sense, ancient art does not survive through material. It survives through being recreated. Each generation does not copy exactly what the previous one did. The continuity of ancient art is not rigid preservation, but a chain of selective transformation. Humans adjust form to new circumstances. They add or remove details to suit current needs. They change materials as environments change. They change spaces as ways of living change. Yet across all those changes, one thing is not lost: the idea that certain moments must be separated from everyday life. Not because everyday life is less important, but because it is too dense to reflect upon itself. These separated moments allow humans to pause, to look again, and to reorganize their feelings about the world. They create breathing space within continuous survival space, where a community can be present together without being pulled by immediate necessity. The idea that certain places must be marked, not to claim ownership in the sense of individual property, but to recognize that this space once carried shared meaning. When a place is marked by images, by ritual, by repeated action, it is no longer just a point in nature. It becomes part of living history, a surface on which collective memory can hold. And finally, the idea that certain experiences must be shared for a community to continue existing. Not everything can be conveyed by words. Some things are understood only when many people participate together, waiting together, feeling together. Art in its deepest form creates exactly these experiences. Meaning is not explained, but lived together. Because these core functions were preserved, art was not interrupted when humans entered an entirely different mode of life. When settlement began to form, art did not vanish. It was not replaced by agriculture or architecture. Instead, it adapted to a new rhythm of life, found new surfaces, new spaces, and new moments to continue doing its old work. Images stepped out of caves and appeared on house walls, on pottery, on everyday objects. No longer hidden deep in darkness, they became closer to daily life. Yet that closeness did not erase symbolic function. On the contrary, it allowed meaning to seep into routine, turning repeated actions like eating, storing, exchanging into part of a shared order. Sound no longer echoed only in deep caves where only a small group could gather. It spread into open spaces, squares, fields where larger groups could assemble. Rhythm no longer marked only rare moments. It became tied to broader cycles of life, the beginning of planting season, the end of harvest, communal festival days. Sound kept doing its old work, creating synchronization, but on a larger scale. Ritual, once performed in darkness and separation, became more tightly bound to clearer biological and social milestones, birth, coming of age, pairing, death. Ritual space opened outward, including more people, yet its core structure remained sequence repetition, a shared moment set apart from ordinary life. In this way, art was not left behind by history. It traveled with history, changed shape when needed, but did not change its deepest function. It continued helping humans mark time, attach to place, and maintain a sense of belonging within communities that grew increasingly complex. So, when we look back at the long flow of ancient art, we do not see absolute breaks. We see layers stacking upon layers. Older forms fade, but they do not vanish entirely. They are absorbed, transformed, and continue living within new forms. And it is this ability to transform, not immobility, that is the deepest reason ancient art could accompany humans from caves to villages, from darkness into light, while still keeping its essential role in social life. If ancient art were merely a random reaction to a prehistoric environment, it would have ended when that environment changed. But reality is the opposite. Art followed humans through every major transition, from hunting to farming, from mobility to settlement, from small bands to larger communities. This shows that art is not a byproduct of one specific historical phase. It is a mechanism of social adaptation. In unstable times, art helps a community remain cohesive. In transitional periods, art creates a sense of continuity. In more complex societies, art helps organize identity and power. And because it performs these functions, art cannot disappear unless humans no longer need to live together. There is another paradox that matters. Ancient art did not need to be consciously preserved in order to endure. No one in the Paleolithic thought about heritage preservation. No one tried to protect paintings for later generations. No one planned for art to survive tens of thousands of years. But precisely because it was not framed, not fixed art, gained flexibility. It was allowed to change without being judged as losing the original. It was allowed to merge into life. And by doing so, it avoided the fate of objects that are simply forgotten. A tradition survives only when it remains useful, not materially, but socially. Ancient art endured because it continued doing something no other tool could fully replace it, created a shared space for emotion, memory, and collective action. Even today, when we no longer understand the original meaning of each image, each pattern, each rhythm, we still recognize that fact. We still stand for a long time before cave paintings. We still feel a presence inside those spaces. Not because they are beautiful by modern standards, but because they were made from the same deep need, the need to connect. So the question, why didn't ancient art disappear, can be answered in a very simple way. It did not disappear because it was never only an object. It was the way humans learned how to live together. As long as humans still need shared memory, still need moments set apart from daily life, still need signs that say we belong to the same place, the same stream of time, then art in one form or another will continue to exist. Not as a relic of the past, but as a living structure born very early and never absent from human history. For most of their history, humans did not live in cities. They had no writing, no recorded history. But they did not live in silence. They left images behind. They created sound. They repeated shared actions in the same places, in the same ways, across many generations. From very early on, art was not decoration added to an already stable life. It was part of how humans existed together in an uncertain world. When places could always be lost, art held memory in place. When time passed without clear markers, art created rhythm. When communities faced the risk of coming apart, art created moments to return to one another. That is why ancient art did not disappear. It did not need protection in order to survive. It only needed to keep being lived in one form or another, from caves to villages, from darkness into light, from images on stone to the symbols that surround us today. And if there is one final thing this 40,000-year journey reminds us, it is this: art does not begin when humans are abundant. It begins when humans need one another. When you leave this story, you may be in a brightly lit room, a crowded city, a world very different from those distant caves. But the deepest patterns are still there. The need to mark, the need to share, the need to create moments set apart from ordinary life, to remember that we are not here alone. If this story causes you to pause for a moment, if it leads you to see those ancient images not as ruins, but as living signs, then perhaps in a very quiet way, ancient art is still doing exactly the work it has done for tens of thousands of years, and that journey has never truly ended.